The Arizona sun was merciless that afternoon, beating down on the rocks with an intensity that made the air shimmer and dance. Thomas Reed wiped sweat from his brow as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon, taking the shortcut back to his ranch after a supply run to Silver Creek. He was a simple man, 28 years old, unmarried, content with his small spread of cattle and the solitude that came with frontier life. The sound reached him first, a low moan, almost animal-like in its pain. Thomas reined in his horse, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Apaches still raided through this territory, and the cavalry's response had been brutal. Trust was a commodity in short supply on both sides. He found her wedged between two boulders, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. She couldn't have been more than 19, her face contorted with pain, dark hair matted with sweat and blood. An Apache girl, wearing traditional clothing now torn and stained. Her eyes, when they met his, held not fear, but a strange resignation, as if she'd already accepted death. Thomas had a choice. Ride on, pretend he'd never seen her, avoid the complications that helping an Apache would bring. His neighbors would call him a fool or worse. But then her lips moved, cracked and bleeding, trying to form words. And he saw the canteen just out of her reach, probably dropped when she fell. "Aw, hell," Thomas muttered, dismounting. He approached slowly, hands visible. "I'm not gonna hurt you, miss. Looks like you've already got enough hurt for one day." She said something in Apache, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. Water. He uncapped his canteen and knelt beside her, cradling her head gently as he brought the water to her lips. She drank desperately, her throat working as she swallowed. When she'd had enough, she fell back, tears streaming down her face. Whether from pain or relief or both, Thomas couldn't tell. "Your leg's broken bad," he said, knowing she probably didn't understand English, but needing to talk anyway. "We need to get you somewhere safe. I'm gonna splint it best I can, and it's gonna hurt like blazes. You understand?" She stared at him with those dark, intense eyes, and said something that sounded formal, ritualistic. Then she pointed at him, at herself, and made a gesture he didn't comprehend. Hands pressed together, then spread apart and joined again. Thomas worked quickly, fashioning a splint from branches and his spare shirt. She bore the pain with a stoicism that made him wince in sympathy. When he lifted her onto his horse, she was unconscious, which was probably a mercy. His ranch was closest, but taking her there meant trouble. The army post was 10 miles south, but they'd likely throw her in a cell or worse. The Apache camp was somewhere in the mountains, but he had no idea where, and riding into hostile territory seemed like suicide. So he took her home, knowing he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. For 3 days, Thomas tended her in his small cabin. He set her leg properly, changed her bandages, spooned broth between her lips when she was lucid enough to swallow. She drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes speaking in rapid Apache, sometimes just staring at him with those penetrating eyes. On the 4th morning, he woke to find her sitting up in his bed, watching him sleep on the floor where he'd been camping out. "You are Thomas," she said in careful English, surprising him. "I am Ayana. You speak English." Thomas sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Mission school, before my people left." She touched her splinted leg gingerly. "You give me water. You save my life. You tend my wounds like I am precious." "Well, any decent person would have." "You are now my husband," she said simply. "By the old laws. When a man gives water to a woman in her dying time, tends her with his own hands, shelters her in his home, they are bound. Husband and wife." Thomas blinked. "I'm your what now?" Thomas sat frozen, trying to process what he'd just heard. Miss Ayana, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I just helped you because you needed help. I didn't mean to marry you. Ayana's expression remained serene, almost amused by his panic. Meaning does not matter. Action matters. The ritual is complete. You gave me life water from your own vessel. You touched me with healing hands. You brought me into your dwelling place. These are the 3 sacred acts of binding. But I didn't know. Thomas stood, pacing the small cabin. I was just trying to keep you from dying. You can't hold a man to vows he never spoke. The vows are in the doing, not the speaking. Ayana shifted on the bed, wincing slightly. This is how my people have married for generations uncounted. Words are wind. Actions are truth. Thomas stopped pacing and looked at her. Really looked at her. Even injured, with her hair tangled and her face still bearing the yellowing remnants of bruises, she was striking. But this was insane. Your people, do they know where you are? They must be searching for you. Something dark crossed Ayana's face. My people believe I am dead. I fell during a raid, trying to escape cavalry soldiers. My horse fell with me into the canyon. No one saw. They would not have been able to stop and search. The soldiers were too close. She met his eyes. In their hearts, I am already gone. If I return as Thomas's wife. This will be acceptable. A woman cannot be alone unmarried. She needs protection, status. And if I say no? If I just take you back and explain this was all a mistake? Then I have no place. Her voice was matter-of-fact. I cannot return unmarried to my people after being in a man's home for days. I am ruined. I would be cast out or forced to marry whichever warrior claims me, whether I wish it or not. And you, she tilted her head, you would be seen as dishonorable, a man who saves a woman only to abandon her to shame. Thomas felt the trap closing around him. This is crazy. This is the way. Ayana's expression softened slightly. I do not ask you to love me, Thomas Reed. I ask only that you accept what is. I will be useful to you. I can cook, tan hides, tend horses, mend clothing. I will earn my place. In time, perhaps we can be comfortable together. Comfortable, Thomas repeated weakly, like a pair of old boots. Despite everything, Ayana smiled. Old boots are very valuable. They know your feet. They do not cause blisters. Over the following days, as Ayana's leg healed and she grew stronger, Thomas discovered she wasn't exaggerating about being useful. She moved through his chaotic bachelor existence like a whirlwind, organizing, cleaning, improving everything she touched. She cooked meals that made his previous efforts look like charred offerings to angry gods. She treated his horses with such skill that his temperamental stallion ate from her hand within hours. And she was funny. Wickedly, dryly funny in a way that caught him off guard. When he burned himself on the stove, she'd commented that perhaps the stove needed the 3 sacred acts to become his wife too, since he couldn't seem to leave it alone. He'd laughed despite himself, but the situation was impossible. His neighbors would be horrified. The army might cause trouble. And the Apache? What if her people came looking, thinking he'd kidnapped her? 2 weeks after finding Ayana, Thomas had visitors. 3 Apache warriors rode up to his ranch at dawn, heavily armed, their faces painted for war. Thomas's blood ran cold. Ayana emerged from the cabin before he could react, speaking rapidly in Apache. The warriors stared at her as if seeing a ghost, then at Thomas, then back at her. The conversation grew heated, with much gesturing. Thomas caught his name several times, and the word he'd learned meant husband. Finally, the eldest warrior turned to Thomas and spoke in broken English. Ayana says you are husband. Truth? Thomas looked at Ayana, standing straight-backed and proud despite her barely healed leg. She met his eyes, and in them he saw not pleading, but quiet strength. A woman who'd survived the fall, the pain, the uncertainty, and was now fighting for the strange new life that had emerged from catastrophe. "Yeah," Thomas heard himself say. "Truth. She's my wife." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. The Apache warriors exchanged glances, and for a moment Thomas thought he'd just sentenced himself to death. Then the eldest warrior, Ayanna, later told him this was her uncle, Neol, dismounted and approached. Thomas forced himself to stand still as Neol circled him, studying him like a horse at auction. The warrior was shorter than Thomas, but moved with lethal grace, and Thomas had no illusions about who would win if this came to violence. Finally, Neol spoke, and Ayanna translated. "He says you, dress like a farmer, not a warrior. Your home is small. Your herd is modest. You are not impressive." "Well, tell him I appreciate the honest assessment," Thomas muttered. Ayanna's lips twitched. She continued translating as Neol spoke again. "But you gave water to his brother's daughter when she was dying. You set her broken bones with care. You did not touch her improperly or treat her as a slave. You claim her as wife in front of armed warriors, though you shake like an aspen leaf." She paused. "He says you are either very brave or very stupid, but either quality can be useful in a husband." Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "So, he's not going to kill me?" More Apache conversation. Then Ayanna smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "He says killing you would make me a widow, which would be inconvenient since we just got you as a husband. But there are conditions." The conditions, as it turned out, were extensive. Thomas would be expected to provide for Ayanna properly. He would learn Apache customs and language. He would allow her family to visit freely. He would attend the autumn gathering if possible, so Ayanna's grandmother could assess whether he was acceptable. And this one made Thomas's head spin. He would accept that Ayanna's people would consider him one of them now, with all the responsibilities and protections that implied. "What if the army finds out I'm connected to Apache families?" Thomas asked Ayanna after her uncle and the other warriors had left, seemingly satisfied. "I could lose everything. Then we lose everything together." Ayanna sat beside him on the porch, her injured legs stretched out. "This is what marriage means, Thomas. What affects one affects both. Your battles become mine. My battles become yours." Thomas looked out over his modest ranch, the land he'd worked for years to build. Then he looked at the woman beside him, this stranger who'd become his wife through ancient laws he'd never heard of, who'd reorganized his life in 2 weeks, who faced uncertainty with more courage than he could muster. "This isn't how I imagined getting married," he admitted. "How did you imagine it?" "Church, preacher, pretty girl in white, awkward dancing at the reception." He rubbed his face, not finding a broken woman in a canyon and accidentally invoking mystical marriage laws. "Life rarely asks what we imagine." Ayanna's hand found his, her fingers calloused and strong. "But sometimes what we do not imagine is better than what we do. You imagined a pretty girl in white. Perhaps she would not cook as well as I do. Perhaps she would not tend your horses with knowing hands. Perhaps she would expect you to be something you are not. And what am I? A man who gives water to the dying even when it costs him." She squeezed his hand. "A man with a good heart under rough clothing. A man worth binding myself to, even if neither of us chose this path." Thomas turned to look at her fully. "You really believe that? Or are you just making the best of a bad situation?" "Both can be true." Ayanna met his gaze steadily. "I believe it and I make the best of it. This is wisdom." Over the months that followed, Thomas learned what Ayanna had meant. The army did come sniffing around, suspicious of his Indian wife, but his quiet stubbornness and the fact that Ayanna had mission school education made them back off. Some neighbors shunned him. Others, surprisingly, proved kind, especially the older settlers who'd learned that survival on the frontier sometimes meant setting aside prejudices. Thomas learned Apache, slowly and badly, much to the amusement of Ayana's family when they visited. He learned her people's stories, their beliefs, their ways of reading the land and sky. And Ayana learned his world too, the brutal economics of ranching, the politics of dealing with suppliers and buyers, the loneliness that had driven him to this isolated existence. They became, as she'd predicted, comfortable, like old boots that knew each other's shape. But somewhere along the way, comfort deepened into something else. Affection, respect, trust, love, when it finally came, surprised them both. Not dramatic or sudden, but quiet and sure, like water finding its level. One evening, a year after he'd found her broken in the canyon, Thomas watched Ayana singing to their infant daughter, a child conceived in tenderness, not obligation. The baby had his eyes and her mother's hair, and represented a future neither of them had planned, but both had chosen to embrace. "Still think this is crazy?" Ayana asked, catching him watching. Thomas crossed to them, kissing the top of her head, then the baby's. "Completely crazy," he agreed. "Best accident I ever made." "Not an accident," Ayana corrected, smiling. "The old laws are wise. They brought you to me when I needed saving. And they brought me to you when you needed saving, too. You just did not know you needed it." She was right, Thomas realized. He'd been living half a life, going through motions, existing without purpose beyond survival. Now he had family, connection, meaning, all because he'd given water to a wounded girl and accidentally married her, according to laws he'd never heard of. Some gifts, he thought, come wrapped in the strangest packages,